Hello, Keith Livingston here with Healthy Intelligent Training. Today I'm speaking to Mr. Running in Australia, Trevor Vincent. Trevor's just had his 82nd birthday yesterday and he's a fountain of history for the Australian distance running scene. And so we're going to ask Trevor a few questions about the glorious running past of Victoria and Australian running. Okay, over to you, Trevor. How did you get started?
Oh, well, Keith, I was born, just before World War II, and so, played footy and cricket and so on at school as a kid, but there was no athletic scene, and I wasn't even aware of the sport when I was at school, primary school. And then I went to secondary school, and probably year 11, for some reason or other, I started running. Up to that, as I say, I'd been playing football and cricket, but the school sports were on, school athletic sports, and I just entered in the 880 and the mile. Never raced before. I don't think I'd ever trained before. I might have competed a little bit in the scout sports. I was in the Boy Scouts for a while. But anyhow, in the scout sports, in the school sports, I ran in the 880 and the mile, and I won them both. So that was a big surprise. And so that was the sort of start of my interest in athletics. That was late 1954 when I was about 16 and a half. So I hadn't run before that. But I was aware of athletics, and the thing that inspired me, or the occurrences that inspired me, were the Landy-Bannister clashes and and the efforts to break 4 minutes for the mile, the big race in Vancouver in 1954. So I followed all that. I followed Landy, and Landy's been an idol of mine right through from those days, and he was one of my inspirations. And around that, as I say, around that time, 1956, when I got involved with a club, Glen Huntly, and I joined them late in 1955. So in 55, I just played footy and ran during this winter of 1956 and the lead up to the Olympic Games. And the Olympics were an incredible sort of inspiration for everybody, an opportunity to see the best in action. We saw Zatopek, and we saw, probably not at his best, but we saw Kutz and Elaine Mamoon, all the top athletes, Betty Cuthbert, all the top Australian sprinters. So 56 was a great inspiration for me. And the other person that I'd got a little bit involved with and did a lot more later on was a guy named Dave Stevens. Dave ran with a club, Williamstown here, but in late 1955, he raced against a team of Hungarians who all held world records, distance running world records. And much to everyone's surprise, Dave beat them. And then in early 1956, Dave, and as I say, he was an Australian, but he lived in my area. He lived in Caulfield, and he used to do a milk round, but he broke the world record for 6 miles. And that was an incredible inspiration again for everyone. He went into the games probably as one of the hopes, but unfortunately Dave didn't produce the goods. He had some injury problems. So yeah, that was how I started. Started running, as I say, I competed in the 1956 winter season and had no great ambitions or aims or whatever, but I just enjoyed what I did. I enjoyed the winter, cross country, and always right through my career, I enjoyed cross country, distance running. I don't think I was much, I never tried sprinting, but I doubt whether I would have been much of a sprinter, but I found middle distance suited me well. So that was the early days, Keith.
Oh, that's really quite interesting. So did you train a lot with Dave Stevens?
Well, the situation with Dave was that he used to run on Caulfield Racecourse, and that's where our club was based. So we did a lot of our running on Caulfield Racecourse, and never really on proper tracks, but we ran on the racecourse. Dave used to train there, and I'd see him around those days. And people like John Landy used to train on Caulfield Racecourse. In fact, before the 56 Olympics, Vladimir Kutz came out and ran there, so it was a fairly popular spot. But Dave retired pretty well straight after the 56 Olympics. He was pretty disappointed. He didn't run well. He had an injury problem, but he came back probably in 59. And when he was living in our area, and when he came back, he joined our club and started running with us. And so we trained with him a bit, not a lot, but he used to come and run with us, and we'll talk about this later, but he used to come run with us in the Dandenong Ranges. And it was great to have an inspiration, a guy like that who'd been there and done that, but he was just an ordinary guy. And Dave's still around now. He's around 90 and he's still fairly fit and healthy as far as I know. I haven't seen him for a while, but yeah. No, Dave was, a good inspiration for us in those early days, but we only had a lot to do with him probably around the time of the 60 Olympics when he tried to make the team. Just missed out, and then that was the last we saw of Dave. But so I went on with it after 56, and in fact, in 1957, I think I ran in the the Australian 3,000 metre steeplechase championship. I'd only run one or two steeples in Melbourne, and then the steeplechase championship was on in Melbourne, the Australian championship, and so I had a run in that, and that was the first of staging of an official Australian steeplechase. Prior to that, Australia were represented in the 56 Olympics by 3 athletes in the steeplechase, but there was no Australian championship. So I was fortunate to run in the first one. I was second in that to a guy named Graham Thomas, who ran in the Melbourne Olympics in the steeple. Yep.
Okay, so now coaching. Who coached you?
Interesting question, Keith. No, nobody. There were some sort of mentors at the club, guys who'd been around the club for quite a long time, who I used to run with, but no one to coach me. And in fact, the earliest sort of information I could get about training and coaching was from, I've got it here with me, Franz Stamfel. So Franz Stamfel wrote a book called Franz Stamfel on Running, and that came out in 1955. And in my copy of the book, I used to follow that. I used to use his training schedules, and I had in pencil written what my sessions were. So that was probably, I started keeping diaries in 1957. I've still got the 1957 diary, and I'd run about 5 times a week following Stamfel's training. So it was all repetition work, repetition 440 yards, 660s, 880s, which people can convert to metric if they like, but that's all we knew in those days. And I followed what he said, and we did it all on the race course, so nothing on the track. And around that time, I also, at that time, I was aware of Emil Zatopek, and the other book, I've got it here too. It's just the book that I had in those days. It's just a book called Zatopek. And what's it called? Zatopek, the Marathon Victor. And as we know, Zatopek won the treble in 1952 in the Olympic Games. So Zatopek was the one who sort of reading that book, and from our own sort of experience, we started to do what we called then Zatopek type sessions, which are similar to fartlek, but it was on the race course, on the grass, and we did what we called Zatopek sessions, and they'd be Zatopek's, my understanding is Zatopek's training was quite different to fartlek. Fartlek, they do alternate fast, slow jog, but always at a sort of not at full pace, and always with the thought in mind to save something for the races. But Zatopek was quite different to my understanding. Zatopek used to almost run at race pace. He'd run himself almost into the ground in his training. And his feeling about that was that if you trained that way, then the races would feel easy. And seemed to work for him, but we did that sort of thing around the race course. We'd do a hard 440, then jog 220 or furlong. And we did a lot of that around the race course. And then probably around that time, 58, 59, we started to build up a little bit of a training squad at Caulfield and at Glen Huntly. A mate of mine, a friend of mine, good old friend of mine, Tony Cook. Tony came over and he was running with another club, but he lived nearby, and we started to train together. And fairly soon after that, a friend of ours by the name of Frank McMahon took us for the first time. He was the only one who had a car, and he took us up to Belgrave in the Dandenong Ranges, and I think in July 1959, we went running in the forest in the Dandenongs. And that probably made the big difference. It made a huge difference because we were running in an environment that we enjoyed. running up and down hills, but we're always in conversation with the others. The numbers built up. So fairly soon after that, we had a guy that you might have heard of, Ron Clark. In the mid-50s, early mid-50s, Ron had been a world record holder for the mile as a junior, 17, 18. He almost made the Olympic team in 56 at the age of about 19. In the late 50s, or after the middle of the late 50s, he gave away running and started playing football and got devoted to his work and his studies and so on. But then later on, probably around 1960, end of 1960, Ron came over and joined us at the racecourse, and that was the start of the build-up of quite a strong group. And so when you say, did we have a coach? We sort of coached ourselves. We came up with these ideas. We'd experienced the Dandenongs. We'd done all our running on Caulfield Racecourse on the grass. So it was the sort of environment that we really enjoyed. We had a few more join us, and then my first overseas trip was to your homeland. I was picked in a Victorian or a state team to compete in New Zealand. And we ran 3 cross-country races in New Zealand, in Hamilton, Dargaville.
Yep.
You know where Dargaville is. And then we dominated those two races. There were 6 Victorians. We went and ran in those races. But then the third race, which was the highlight of the trip, we ran at Ellerslie Racecourse in Auckland, and we ran against who you'd call Arthur's boys. First time I got to meet Arthur Lydiard, Barry McGee, Murray Hellberg, Bill Bailey. They all ran in that race, and that was an incredible experience for us because Murray had been an Olympic champion. Barry had won bronze medal in the Rome Olympics in the marathon. So we got to race those guys, and after cleaning up all the people in the country towns, we got to Auckland and we got blown away by those New Zealanders. I think Barry won it. Bill was second. A guy named
Vern Walker.
Hey?
Vern Walker.
Vern Walker. Yeah, of course it's Vern. I should know Vern. I've been in touch with him lately.
Yeah.
Vern was third. Murray was fourth, and I was fifth. So I beat a few of the New Zealanders, and that was an incredible experience for us. And whilst we could talk about Arthur and Percy Cerity, certainly meeting Arthur was a great experience, and rather than take on board so much what they were doing, it just reassured us that we were on the right track. We were doing we'd sort of discovered it ourselves. We'd found that the sort of training we were doing, the fartlek or Zatopek type training, long runs in the hills, and so getting in 2-hour runs, something that people didn't do earlier than that. There wasn't much in the way of long running around. In fact, I think we were the first people that ran in the Dandenongs. The thing that kept us going, the Dandenongs, and we went there every Sunday, starting in 1959, and I still go up every Sunday now, so that's 60 years later. I still go up on Sundays and slowly jog a little bit, but I go for a walk, and that's the highlight of my week. So we went up the Dandenongs fairly soon after that. That friend of mine I mentioned, Frank McMahon, Frank bought a house in a place called Ferny Creek, and it was a bit of a ramshackle place, and he didn't live there permanently. He was a school teacher, but he made it available for us, and we used to go there every Sunday, and we'd meet at the house, and then go and do our runs together. We'd run as a group. We had our set courses. We had a 13-mile course, a 15-mile, 22-mile, and they were all quite long, a little bit like the New Zealand courses.
Yeah, I remember running up in the Fern Tree Gully.
Yeah, Dandenong
runs early in my stay in Australia.
Yeah. So that was really what turned us on. And we talked about Dave Stevens before. Dave used to come up there when he made that comeback, and he'd run with us at Ferny Creek. It was a bit in the early days up there. After he'd retired, Herb Elliott was still around a little bit. Herb came up a couple of times, and he enjoyed the environment. It's the sort of thing that would have suited him. We also had some of the New South Wales athletes when they were in Melbourne. They'd enjoy coming up there. Albie Thomas, Dave Power, quite a few of those guys. So it was. I think we were very fortunate in having that sort of environment here, and also in having that great running group. After the New Zealand trip, the big thing that happened was that the Commonwealth Games were held here in Australia, in Perth, in 1962, and we finished up getting, I made the team in the steeple, Ron Clark made the team, and Tony Cook both made the team in the 3 mile and 6 mile. Another mate of ours, Rod Bonella, made the team in the marathon. So we were pretty well represented. And out of that, I won the steeple. Ron got second in the 3 mile, and Rod got third in the marathon. So we brought home a few medals from Commonwealth Games in Perth. So that sort of inspired us, and the group continued to get strong. So, we moved on after 62. Yep. Oh, we also ran seriously cross country. And even right through his career, Ron, even he's competing overseas later on and running in Europe, in the European summer. Whenever he was around, he'd always run cross country, and he was a great club man, incredible person to have around as part of the club. And we had a very strong team, relays and team races and all that sort of thing right through winter. And in summer, same thing. Whenever we were around, we'd race inter-club, we'd race regularly, and that was part of our strategy was training and racing. So we didn't sort of take much time. We'd go from a summer season where we'd race track, and then we'd go straight into winter season where we'd run distance cross country and road, and had a great environment, great numbers from the club, and it was a real social sort of experience.
Yeah, so I think the social aspect of training is very important. What I experienced growing up with the New Zealand system, with the Lydia system, is a very social environment.
Yeah, that's right.
Get up to all kinds of hijinks on the long runs with some of the rogues who were running around then. Some are quite famous now, but we won't go there right now.
And on the social side of it, we used to meet at Frank's house. Pardon me, and quite often we'd stay and we'd at least have coffee and tea, or a bit of morning tea. Occasionally we'd stay the weekend, and we had our famous courses that are still famous now. We had what we call the 2 Mile Hill, which was a very popular run. We had some runs through the forest. Another person who trained up there in the early 60s, late 50s, an athlete named Brenda Carr. So she was a female member of our club, and she was probably one of the few distance running females around. And Brenda thrived on that sort of experience, and she actually went to Rome in 1960 and won silver in the 800 metres. First time the race, well, not first time, I think it was held in 32, but it was the return of the 800 metre event to the Olympic Games, and she ran incredibly well in that. It was the only distance race, and Brenda really set things up for Australians in that period. There were others as well. Dixie Willis was around, and they both held the world record for 880, 800 metres. So that the team environment, a little bit of rubbishing and telling stories and so on when we ran. But then there was the serious part of it where we'd find, occasionally we'd take it in turns to lead on the training runs. And so, you'd put in surges on not the great big hills, but on some of the undulating surfaces. You'd take it in turns, but not the same. We wouldn't let Clarkie lead all the way. We'd never keep up with him, but he had to take it in turns. And so everyone take a turn to lead and push the pace along. Yep.
Yeah. Now, speaking of Clarkie, you're one of the few distance runners of the day in Australia to have beaten Ron Clark. It was over cross country, wasn't it? At Warragul, was it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I've got a film of that race. Yeah, that race at Warragul, that was 1961, I think. Yeah, it was a Warragul, a 5 mile cross country. And at that stage, we were a bit, myself, Ron, Tony Cook, were all sort of neck and neck in cross country and on the track. We went round to warm up before the race, and I went with Ron and Cookie. And as we came, it was one of those true cross country courses. So you had fences and creeks to run through. And there are a couple of places there where they actually had gates that they'd closed. And as we came through, Cookie and Clarkie had opened the gate, try and leave it open. But then I'd go back and close it again, and that's where I got the break. So, I think that that gave me an advantage. But yeah, I've got footage of that race. That was good. But I held my own with Ron right through, almost right through both of our careers in the short races up to about a mile. occasionally beat him in a 3 mile, but that was when he wasn't watching. I once won the Australian 3 mile championship, and I beat Albie, Thomas and Ron. But that was just because I think they sort of forgot about me. They raced each other, and then I was sitting around. They ran too slowly. But yeah, we had there was great enmity on the track, but off the track we were the best of mates. Same with those New South Wales guys, Albie Thomas, Dave Power, Alan Lawrence, who was a little bit before us, but a great number of those New South Wales guys. Bob Bagg. Bob was a good friend of ours, and Bob went to Tokyo for the marathon in '64.
And what about Clohessy, Pat Clohessy? Where did he come into the scheme of things?
Well, Pat was actually, his mum lived in Caulfield, but Pat went over to the US in around the early 60s, probably around 1960, went over to the US, went to a University of Houston and he did his degree there, and he went on and did masters, and he came back. He actually, none of us knew of him. We didn't really know him, but we knew of him. And out of the blue, he got picked in the Australian team for the Commonwealth Games in 1962 on the basis of a mile race he'd run in the US. So he came out and ran in Perth in the Commonwealth Games, and that's when we got to know each other. And then he became an informal member of Glen Huntly at that stage, but then he came back to Australia after he'd finished his degree and lived in Caulfield and started running with us in probably 1964, just before we went off to Tokyo for the Olympics. And Pat he turned out to be one of Australia's great coaches, but he was a great athlete as well. He won an NCAA 3 mile title in the US, and he had some pretty quick times. He's a great competitor and fitted in really well with our group. And later on, as you're well aware, he went on to coach Rob de Castella and quite a few others, Simon Doyle. So he had a great success as a coach, but he shouldn't be underestimated as what a great athlete he was as well. So yeah, he added to the quality of the field. He came back with that American experience.
That sort of brings me to the modern Australia, what's called the Australian system, I guess.
Yeah.
Now, that originated perhaps in Melbourne. Is it fair to say?
Oh yeah, there was as I mentioned before, back in the mid-50s in New South Wales was the strength, and they had Albie, and guys who went to the Olympics in '56, Albie Thomas, Dave Power, Al Lawrence, Graham Thomas. They had quite a few in the '56 team in the distance events. But when the real things started to happen in Melbourne, and we took over from New South Wales in the late '50s, and in those early days there weren't many coaches around, and so most of us had to do what we sort of could come up with, or what we could read, or what we could hear from others. And most people sort of followed the same sort of idea, longer runs, getting up the Dandenongs. After the original group of us started to go up the Dandenongs in the late 50s, early 60s, the numbers grew, and people from lots of clubs. And these days there's a wide range of clubs. The benefit about running up there was that, one of the benefits to the athletes was that they didn't just get to run with their own club mates, they ran with different groups, and they could discuss their training ideas and the sorts of things they were doing, and they were always in a situation to learn from that. And that sort of training is what still happens now. It's Chris Wardlaw was a real strong advocate of that. Chris went to 2 Olympics in the 10K and marathon, became a great coach, and he's written some terrific stuff about training, and his training schedules are along the same lines. The long run on the weekend, medium long run during the week, a couple of track sessions, recovery sessions, a mixture of fartlek. So that's the sort of thing that started then, and it still happens now. It's the same sort of philosophy as far as the training's concerned, and I think that largely it's pretty similar to what the New Zealanders were doing. The other great influence here in Australia to a lot of people was Percy Cerity, and that started probably in the 40s. Percy came back from being an overweight, unhealthy sort of guy, and in his mid-40s to getting very fit, running long distances, and he started a training camp down in the beachside suburb called Portsea. Herb Elliott went and trained with him, and he was a product of Percy's training. And Percy's written stacks of books. My bookshelf behind me, I've got a stack of Percy books. And they're always good reading and great stories, running on the sand hills, tracks round through the bush down at Portsea. Very little on actual track training in spikes. Racing. The thing was with Herb that I'm not sure that Herb didn't go on with his running after he retired after 1960 Olympics. And he was only 22, 23. So maybe Herb didn't get the great enjoyment out of it. But Perce had some success. In the early days, he assisted Albie Thomas, John Landy. John spent some time down at Portsea. Quite a few others did. Lots of them did. So Percy was a great influence in Australian distance running. Together with Percy, Fran Stamfel, and their own experience and learning, talking to Arthur Lydiard and seeing those New Zealanders in action, actually getting over and racing them, was certainly made a big difference for us. And I think that these days, perhaps the opportunity to go and race and compete in New Zealand is something that people should be looking for a bit more, and it doesn't happen. Same with the New Zealanders. They occasionally in those days, they used to come here quite often. We raced against them. When Ron and I ran in New Zealand, ran a few meets in Dunedin in 1963 against John Davies, and John was a good friend of ours, good mate of mine, and we kept in touch right through. John went on to win bronze in the 1500 in Tokyo, but in 63, Ron and I went over there and we raced against John, and John cleaned us up. But we both ran PBs. John ran 4 minutes and a few tenths in the mile, and I ran 4:1.7 in Dunedin, which stayed my best time, and Ron was just behind in 4:03. So they were massive improvements for both of us. And then I just talk a little bit more about Dunedin and that trip. The interesting thing about that trip was that I'd run steeple in the Commonwealth Games, and prior to that, and they wanted to put on a steeple in Dunedin, and they had no water jump in Dunedin. They had a bitumen track and grass in the middle, so they dug a water jump, put in a hurdle, and so we did a steeple there. We ran off the grass, off the bitumen track onto the grass, over the water jump, and then back onto the bitumen. And I've got a great photo which I won't release. I've got a great photo of me on one attempt over this water jump. My foot slipped and I hit the top of the hurdle and went head first in the water and almost drowned. But I still got up, and shows you how weak the New Zealand record was at that stage. I still broke the New Zealand record.
Oh, they were running well over 9 minutes for a long time in New Zealand.
Yeah, well, I ran 8:52, and I think that the record before that was about 8:55. There's a guy named Kerry Williams, I think.
He was very good, Kerry Williams.
Yeah, well, Kerry held the New Zealand record. He was a little bit before me. But Kerry held the New Zealand record, and I broke his record when I fell in the water. I went back a year or two later and ran 8:42, so that was a little bit better.
Yeah, that's Kerry Williams was a mentor of Rod Dixon in Nelson. He was an excellent runner. So So
Kerry, he was a great athlete.
Yeah, I think he might have medalled in Kingston.
Peter Welsh. Yeah, no, I raced Peter. I raced Peter in the early 60s.
Yeah.
Problem was, that Peter and he was probably in that race or the year or two after, and Peter, I handled Peter all right then, but by the time 66 came round, he won the Commonwealth Games and ran about 8:26 or 8:29, something like that. So, Peter was a fine athlete. I don't know whether I don't think he kept going much after that. I'm not sure he made an Olympic team. I don't think so.
No, he's just one of these guys who just popped up and then sort of disappeared. Like a lot of these guys are still around when I started running in the 70s, mid-70s.
Yeah.
Quite a few of them, but Peter Welsh wasn't.
No, I think Peter was a doctor, and he might have concentrated on his studies and his work.
Yeah.
He ran sub 8:30, I know. He was a fine athlete, Peter. So, you've turned out a few there. You've had a few steeple chases there in New Zealand, I know. Oh, the other thing that I do regularly, as you're probably aware, one of my activities now is a site on Facebook called Australian Distance Running Nostalgia, and so that keeps me fairly occupied. Next time we'll talk to you about my running coaching and squad at Monash University.
Yep, we'll do that.